All right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at in the world. Good to see you here for our first webinar of 2021. Again, you're here for an Altero software webinar on how to build a rock solid backup and DR strategy. My name is Andy Syrewicze, a technical evangelist here with Altero Software. And, I've got a good buddy of mine here with us today, the author of the Backup Bible that we're going to be talking about here shortly. I've got Eric Siron with me. How's it going, my friend?
Doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Good to have you here, and we've got a wealth of information to share with viewers today. So again, we're here talking about, how to build a rock solid backup and DR strategy. And one thing I want to really kind of frame up as we start stepping through the content here is, we're going to present a bunch of example use cases, right? And the point of this webinar is not to say, oh, hey, if this is your use case, this is exactly what you should do, right? That's not what the point of this webinar is. What we're trying to do here is teach you how to go through the process of creating your backup and DR plan, right? So I mean, that whole, give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, right? So that's kind of the concept here as we kind of step through the webinar today. So let's go ahead and talk about our agenda. So first thing we're gonna do is, we're just gonna, kind of introduce ourselves, introduce, Altero, the topic a little bit, and then we're gonna step through kind of some baseline stuff, right? Like why have a strategy? What are some backup and DR fundamentals that you should really be aware of and think about as you start stepping through this process? And then we'll get into our case studies. Now, a word about the case studies. One of the case studies is came from the sign-up form. So if you remember when you signed up for the webinar, there was a form saying, hey, are there any interesting case studies that you'd like to talk about? For the case study one, we picked one that seemed to be kind of a recurring theme as we got some of the registration. So thank you for that. We're going to be talking about that in a second. Case study two is kind of a more highly regulated example that we see quite frequently. And then case study three, you're going to actually help put that one together. So that's going to be kind of a fun exercise as we get to case study three, and then we'll talk through it and we'll kind of work together kind of what the plan is. So from there, we'll also do some Q&A and some wrap up at the end. So quick word about the Q&A. If there's a question that we can kind of answer organically as we step through the webinar today, we'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, feel free to keep putting those questions in the Q&A form, and we will be sure to address those as we get to the Q&A section at the end of the webinar, and we'll answer as many of those as we have time for. And as always, we always try to do a follow-up blog post that contains a full list of the Q&A, a recording of the webinar, and all that, so you can get that information later on, especially if you didn't get your question answered. So let's do some introductions. So I guess I'll introduce myself first. So again, my name is Andy Syrewicze. I'm a technical evangelist with Altero Software. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the cloud and data center management competency, as well as a VMware vExpert. Been in the industry for 20 years, mostly in a MSP capacity. So, when I'm thinking about the stuff, I'm always kind of looking at it through the MSP angle, but I did spend a lot of time in manufacturing, enterprise IT, as well as some time in educational IT as well. So if you want to reach out to me on Twitter there, my apologies, you have to spell the last name. It's just at @Syrewicze, and feel free to hit me up there if you have any other questions or follow-up thoughts, and more than happy to talk to you there. So what I'll do now is I'll hand it over to Eric for his introduction.
Everyone, I'm Eric Siron. I have been in the industry for about 20 years. I have mostly done support for small and medium enterprises, all the way from one seat up to several hundred as outsourced support. And I have been working internal IT at like a 25,000 user hospital. I'm not sure exactly how many people we have, but somewhere around 25,000 for the last few years. And I think most of you know me that I do a substantial amount of writing on Hyper-V, and I'm branching out into more backup stuff to kind of keep the Altero blog bolstered. So good to meet everyone.
All right, appreciate having you here, Eric. We got a lot of good content here that we're waiting to hear from you on. So let's talk about Altero Software, again, the sponsor of today's webinar. Altero Software, we were founded in 2009. We've got offices all over the world. And we recently partnered, you probably saw on the slide, we've recently partnered with email security company, Hornet Security. So that's why you see some of the Hornet Security logos here in the slide deck. Really, we're kind of targeted towards company with 1,000 less employees. We've got 50,000 plus customers worldwide, 10,000 plus partners, 2,000 plus MSPs. And we've seen some really strong growth over the last, during that time period, right? So there'll be a little bit more information on the product and kind of what we do a little bit later through the webinar, and we'll kind of get to the content now. So the first thing I want to do is I always like to kind of start with a poll just to get an idea where everybody's at. So the first poll that I'm going to present here is, how detailed is your current backup and DR plan? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. And I'm fairly certain I know how this is going to play out. So, I'm going to guess that it's kind of the middle of the road. There's probably, like one refresh in the last 5 years, and there's probably just, one guy that kind of owns it. What's your estimation here, Eric? Where do you think people are going to land?
Well, for the first 10 years, I would say I don't even know that you have the dot on there. It's like we have one and I know where it is and I know what the blinky lights mean, and that's about it.
Or the blinky lights. And yeah, it's kind of shaping up how I thought it would. I think it's going to be especially loaded towards the middle, like most of the polls we put up here are. So I'm going to give that another 10 seconds or so here, and we will close it for responses. And yeah, definitely kind of sitting right in the middle from where I thought. So let me close that, and we will share the results. So yeah, most people stated that, let me arrange my window here. I can't quite see it. Yeah, so it is refreshed and managed on a regular basis. So that's kind of what I thought. I'm surprised at the 3% we got at the high end of the poll here. The whole organization is involved. That is a rarity, as we can see in the poll here. It's the same as it was when I took over. 7% said a backup strategy. What's that? Yeah, we're here to help today, trust me.
Yeah.
So yeah, this kind of shaped up exactly about where I thought it would. And I am also glad to see that 30% say it's discussed heavily within the IT team and managed on a regular. So really, I guess where we're at with this, and speaking in generalities, the more eyes on it, the better, right? So definitely happy to see that. So okay, I'm going to go ahead and hide that, and we'll move on with the presentation. So first, to kind of cue things up, why have a strategy, right? I mean, it kind of seems obvious, but I again kind of want to set that baseline for us today. So first off, the obvious one, right? Disasters can do and will happen. My grandmother actually had a saying when housework was we were building something around the house, like, okay, you guys better watch out and plan in case Murphy shows up. Of course, referring to Murphy's law, right? If something can go wrong, it will, right? So definitely that's one of the main reasons we want to plan and have a strategy. Now, some more concrete and maybe humorous examples, one thing that's very common that I've seen in the industry is, as a system administrator, we look at, hey, look at that cool infrastructure project. I want to go install that cluster over there, or I want to, install that new fancy feature in Windows Server. And backup and DR isn't really, like all that interesting, right? As in terms of the other things that we could be working on, but it's so important and you can't neglect it. Another kind of funny example I stumbled upon the other day when I was preparing the slide deck was, mistakes. Mistakes can and do happen. We'd like to pretend that they don't, but they do happen. You have a case where a junior administrator makes a mistake, right? Definitely you want to be in a situation where you know what the plan is and are able to recover from situations like that. And then finally, to kind of wrap things up, before we get on to the more concrete bullet points here, is this is a situation, backup and DR recovery is a situation where I would argue you want to be the dog in the coffee shop that's on fire, because, things are on fire. If you've got a strategy and a plan, you know what happens next. You know who the key stakeholders, you know what the plan is. So you're calm and collected while everything else is on fire, right? I think that's the first time I've ever used that meme in that, from that standpoint. So all jokes aside, let's get to some more concrete examples here. A simple copy is not enough, right? When you're talking about backup and DR, there's so many people I've talked to over the years that, oh yeah, I backed up to a USB hard drive and all my data is sitting in Bob's garage on the other side of town, right? I mean, When we're talking about comprehensive backup and DR recovery options, that a simple copy is not enough. It's got to be more than that. I've found over the years that having a strategy, talking about a strategy, it really removes disconnects from within the organization. I can't tell you how many times I've run into a situation where talking with the IT manager who says, hey, this is what our RTO, this is what our RPOs are, and then talking with the CEO, the leadership of that same company, and they're like on different planets, right? So going through this process, going through this strategy really helps get everybody on the same page. I gotta mention this third one already. You want to have certainty during a disaster. Your strategy helps you do that. Having a strategy implies revision as well, right? So you're playing a game of chess. You start maybe with a particular strategy in mind, and then hey, your opponent, they take the the mid board sooner than you planned on. Now you have to pivot. You have to change your strategy. You have to revise it, right? Your same thing applies to your backup and DR plan. And then here is kind of a key point that I think you're going to see hit on several times as we go through these case studies, is that different data sets have different needs, right? It's really difficult, especially when you get into larger, more complex organizations, to say, oh, okay, this whole organization, our RTO is 12 hours and our RPO is 10 hours, whatever, right? It's hard to put those blanket statements in terms of RTO and RPO across the entire organization. The reality is that your different workloads inside that organization have different RTO and RPO needs, right? So from there, I'm going to hand things over to Eric, and he will first talk about the backup Bible, and as well will kind of lead us into the first case study. So I'll let you take it away, my friend.
Thank you for that great introduction. You kind of did a lot of my work for me.
Sorry.
That's great. So the big thing with the backup Bible is really to try to help you define that plan that Andy was just talking about, where you think beyond just a simple copy. Whenever we talk about backup, backup is the core, and then the disaster recovery planning goes around it, and it's the big shell, and it's the hard work and the stuff that isn't fun, and the things where I got into this job to play with computers, and I do my DR planning, and I don't seem like I play with computers very much during that. So it's obnoxious and not fun, and sometimes you're just kind of lost on where to get started. So you guys can all read for yourselves. These are the bullet points that it really tries to touch on. And I think one thing that I was particularly focused on during this was the build out of the checklist, so that when you're sitting there and you don't really know where to get started, I hope that these checklists will show you and give you an idea, so you can look at these and go, okay, so maybe these fields aren't exactly what I need, because as Andy said, there's no one size fits all, and there's no one way to do it. We just kind of want to give you that initial push to get you out the door, get you going, get things started, and hopefully in a completely neutral way, that whatever product you're coming to and whatever industry you're in, that there's something in there useful for you. And as we noticed here, that it is attached here, so if you don't already have your copy, you can go get yourself one.
Yeah, definitely. And just so people know, we'll also include a URL at the end of the slide deck as well, so you can go look at the URL page as well if you want. And after our first case study, I'll scroll through and show some of the checklists that Eric was just talking about really briefly as well, so you kind of know what the checklists within the backup Bible look like.
Now, the big parts when you're writing a book is, I have all the pages that I need, and I can just keep writing and writing and writing. So what I wanted to do with this is kind of bring it down to, when you're sitting down, you already know why you want to do a disaster recovery plan. That's not the question. The question is, how do we keep this in scope? So if you can answer these three questions at the drop of a hat, then you got a handle on it. And so I want to start with the engineering portion, in that, especially like from a provider, you can walk in, sit down with the executives and scare them into doing whatever you want. That's not all that hard. But then you look 5 years down the road and you come back in and warranties are expiring and your storage equipment is failing and so on and so forth. And you sit down with those same people and they're like, you came in here 5 years ago and you sold us this doom and gloom thing, and none of that ever happened. And we dropped $100,000 on this and we never used it. And as executives, their job is to maximize profit, and your DR strategy does not do that unless you have a problem. And hopefully you don't have a problem. So the best DR plan is one that never goes into action. And so they're like, we don't want to spend any more money on this again. So your previously $100,000 budget is now $10,000. So you have to think, how am I going to keep this sustainable? How do I make sure I get everything that I need, but I don't go over the top with it? And then on the next one, you kind of follow along with that same deal is you have to satisfy almost certainly some legal requirements to keep data safe, secure, and possibly, depending on your environment, a certain amount of time. And even if you don't have the legal oversight, you still have the ethical requirement to your customers and to your employees to protect their information. So that goes into, if you're not protecting that, then you have not engineered high enough. And then the final portion there is you need to be able to test it. So let's say you come up with a rock solid backup solution. It's under 87 layers of encryption, and you need 40 people to decrypt it. And then we put it inside this big concrete box, and then we put that inside another box that can withstand from 10 Kelvin all the way up to 200,000 Kelvin, and then we put it on the other side of the moon. That's pretty safe data. But how are you going to prove to anybody that you did it? You can't, right? Because you can't get your data. So you've got to keep all these things. We have to be able to see it, and we have to be sure that we have done our due diligence across the board, that we didn't make it too big, we didn't make it too little, and we can keep this going into perpetuity. And so if you read the Bible, then I hope that it expands out on all of those things and makes it larger, bigger, fits, goes into detail on all these points.
And I think that puts us on case study number 1. So now for kind of the workshop aspect of the webinar today, right? So this is the fun part. So like I mentioned earlier, we had a form on the sign up page. Most of you probably remember it, where you could actually submit your case studies. In this particular first case study, we saw a lot of overlap. A lot of the case studies that were put forward kind of seemed to fall within this category. So we kind of wanted to address it first. So what I figured we'd do is we just kind of start stepping through the process. Like first, let's find out what the company is, what are some of their challenges from a business perspective, and then, how can we set some basic criteria around their backup and DR needs. And then Eric is going to take you through some abbreviated forms that are kind of based off of the backup Bible a little bit, and kind of go through the process of, as the author of the backup Bible, what he would do to kind of step through the process of building a backup and DR plan. So this first case study we've got is really an 80 user supply chain company. So at least here in Michigan, kind of supply chain and manufacturing really goes kind of hand in hand, right? They really have a lot of the similarities and a lot of the same challenges, right? And really for any supply chain organization or any manufacturing facility, the key thing that they all depend on is making sure that that product keeps moving through that organization, right? So I mean, if the product's not moving, they're not billing, they're not collecting income, they're not paying their employees, that product has to move, right? That is their core business function. So, the thing with companies, especially manufacturers and SMB and supply chain companies, kind of in this 80 to 250 user range, I've found that they're large enough to where they have some of those more complex requirements in terms of data and just IT in general. They've got some of the more complex issues like an enterprise would, but they're still technically considered SMB, right? So that's kind of the challenge with organizations like this, is you've got a high degree of complexity, but maybe you don't have the budget needed to actually, do everything that an enterprise would when it comes to backup and DR, right? Now, I mentioned this earlier, and Eric's going to mention it a few more times, I'm sure. Again, disparate departments in any organization, but it really kind of stands out in a supply chain company as well, is that your disparate departments are going to have different RTO and RPO needs based on the criticality of the workload. And Eric's going to expand on that in a second. And what I've seen over the years, and what I kind of recommend personally as well, is that when you're working on your backup and DR plan, obviously you should go from department to department, right? But you should kind of also have a catch-all RTO, RPO type of designation as well too, right? That you kind of fall back on in case there's not something else defined somewhere else. So for the purposes of this particular case study, we're going to say, hey, the general 8-hour RTO, RPO, unless otherwise stated within the backup and DR plan. And in this case, there's no regulatory requirements for this particular company, right? We don't have to worry about, ITAR, PCI, or whatever. But generally, that's kind of what we're working with here from a supply chain company. So Eric, what do you think about this particular use case? I mean, we've probably got a sales department, we've got accounting, we've got shipping and receiving. What I found with a company of this size is it's likely that maybe they're leveraging some sort of cloud service like Office 365 for their email. That seems to be pretty common in this particular demographic. What are your thoughts on this particular use case?
The biggest challenges for this kind of organization is going to be the RPO out on the floor. Because when you look at a smaller enterprise of this configuration, a lot of times, like their tractor trailers, the trailers are a significant portion of their storage location. So they have to get their product off and on those trucks as fast as they can.
Right.
And anytime something stops that is really where you can tell that they're super losing money. And you get into most of the smaller ones, they don't work 24 hours except possibly that dock area. So there, our TOs must be super short because they're paying people to stand around and not do anything. And like you said, if the product's not flowing, neither is the money. So that's the biggest challenge there. And then the smaller they are, the harder it is to keep that going, it seems.
Yep, and just one really quick definition while I'm thinking of it, just in case we've got some more beginner folks on the webinar. So RTO refers to recovery time objective. So if something happens, a workload goes down, how quickly can I get it back, right? That's really what RTO stands for. And RPO, recovery point objective, how much data am I comfortable with losing? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? Is it 10 hours? That's kind of what we're talking about when we mention RTO and RPO. So at this point, Eric, we've kind of defined what our case study is, what our company is. What I'll do is I'll go to the next slide here and I'll kind of let you drive the boat and tell us, what the process looks like, how you would go through actually building out this backup and DR plan.
Right. So you need to begin by gathering information. And one thing that we showed in the Backup Bible is that you have to go out and talk to these other departments outside of IT. And the way that we did it is, you can present them with a form and say anything that you want. Now, this is, as the note says, this one is kind of stripped down a little bit. There are bigger ones in there, and you're going to need to come up with your own. Now, what I would never do, if you can avoid it, is don't just hand them a piece of paper and then walk away. Because if you do that, when you come back, it's like, we can never be down for more than 5 minutes. Every single thing that we have is absolutely critical. If the coffee pot is offline for 2 minutes, the heads are going to roll. And so what you don't want to do is turn that into a confrontation. You need to go back and go, I can do that. What is your department's budget that you're going to put into this? If you give me $25 million, I can assure that you never miss anything. And then it's okay, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. Especially because, again, there's no ROI in your disaster recovery program. You're not getting anything back. So this should be an interactive thing where you go out and say, here, this is where we want to start. This is the information I need from you. Get the back and forth going, and then wind up with a printed out item that you can then file away and say, okay, this is what we agreed to. And you can kind of look over here what we're going on, and they're talking about we can lose data for 2 hours. Our people will keep enough paper or email or whatever to hang on to information for 2 hours. But we also will have customers standing in the room, and if I can't print an invoice now, I've got an angry customer. So they're kind of setting forth what they can tolerate. And so this here's the accounts receivable, and this is obviously very customer back and forth oriented. So they're going to be sensitive to what the customers need. And if you want to go ahead and we can go to another department here. So now we talk to sales. They're obviously very, very customer focused, but for the most part, a lot of depending on your sales team, and like I worked in an organization approximately of this size, and the sales people more or less knew their clientele and kind of what they needed from them. So they could actually survive fairly well as long as they had their phones. And in this day and age, if the voice system goes down, a lot of them will just pop out their cell phones and they'll just keep going. So really for them, it's we kind of put in some numbers here for you, but they may be able to lose more than 30 minutes. And they can a lot of times survive a long time without their computers at all, as long as they can talk to their clients. So we kind of built out an idea here of what's critical to them, and then the backing services and so on and so forth. You notice that sales is different than AR in that respect. So now we're getting into your core business unit, the shipping and receiving department. So they really have to keep, and I put down here the place that I worked in, every single lift unit and every single person out on the dock had some sort of PC that was in constant communication with the mainframe so that they would know, okay, this pallet needs to go onto that trailer. And as I was talking about before, the trailers signify a significant portion of their storage area. So if this PC goes dead and they don't know where to move that next piece of freight, then the whole thing just stops. And you got freight backing up, you got trucks trying to come in, trucks trying to leave, nobody can do anything. It's really terrible. So they're going to put those under critical. And then the wireless infrastructure throughout your warehouse that keeps all those PCs connected, obviously that can't go down, so on and so forth. The label printers, you know, if you're putting something onto a trailer and you got this is going to a customer, you know, the Olive Garden or something, you got to have that on there. So we're really looking at the things that are most important, and we'll see here that their RTO, I put down a business day, but this is only going to be for the data portion, right? They may turn around and say, well, we can lose this data, but because we kind of have maybe a cache or something, you have truck manifests that are probably written on paper or in some separate device, so on and so forth. But the recovery time here, that is what's really critical. They cannot have people standing around. And so you get these forms back from all these different departments, and then we're going to go into the next phase. This is your part of it, where you take, this is what we need, and you have hopefully participated and you agree, yes, this is what you need, and this is legitimate, and this is within our engineering capability. Keep that in mind. So from there, the next part then is going to be to build out your own checklist infrastructure. Here's how you're going to satisfy what they have told you is necessary.
I think that's a good point, Eric, is, you know, it's all this planning and all these conversations and identifying all these key pieces of information first. That's really the difficult part, at least to me, in terms of the backup and DR strategy. The technology piece is the easy part, right? I mean, that's, you know, you can pretty much engineer, you know, whatever solution you need. It's this interactive talking with your key stakeholders, that social piece of it, the planning piece of it, that really is the crux of the backup and DR plan.
Absolutely.
So before I go to case study 2, first off, any final points on that one, Eric?
I think we kind of push it through. I mean, you always get focused on your core business, and from IT, maybe you know what that is, and sometimes you don't. Especially like if you're fairly new, sometimes it's not always obvious what really matters. So that is the biggest thing that I always want to get through with these checklists is what really matters. And if you need to know what really matters, tell them I can do what you want for a whole lot of money. And if they say, okay, tell me more, then you have discovered something that's core to the business. If they're like, well, how about how's $100 do for me? What do I get for $100? And you found something, it's probably not that important.
Boy, I don't want to try and back up and protect anything for $100. Robocopy and a hard drive. Yeah. So just so everybody knows, like we said earlier, we kind of went through the documentation, the checklist piece of it in kind of an abbreviated format for the sake of time. But when you go download your copy of the backup Bible, there's this appendix section here. And as you scroll through here, there's a whole list of checklists. You know, here are the meetings that you need to have, you know, what you should be talking about in those meetings, you know, what is your risk identification, who are your key stakeholders. You know, there's really just a whole list of checklists and things for you to go through. Again, kind of in a neutral fashion. That way, you know, as you step through the process, you know, it's vendor neutral, right? So I mean, why we'd like you to use Altero, obviously, you know, this works for any vendor. Really, we just want, at the end of the day, we just want your data to be safe, right? So yeah, as you download the backup Bible and take a look, keep a special eye out on this template section towards the end. So with that, should we go over to case study 2, Eric?
Knock it out, man.
All right, so case study 2, this should hit home for you, my friend. I know that you work for a fairly large hospital, and you know, we wanted to do a use case and kind of have that conversation around backup and DR for a highly regulated organization, and well, healthcare is a perfect example of that. So in this particular case, you know, I figured we have a 500+ user hospital. Now, realistically, most hospitals are quite a bit larger than that. I think, Eric, you said what, 25,000 for your organization?
Yes, and to be honest, I'm not sure what it looks like across the country or even across the world anymore. It's everything kind of changes. So.
Yeah, it's from my MSP days, we did some work for a couple of hospitals, and they seem to be all over the place. You get a smaller regional hospital, and it might be 500 users, but you get like a huge hospital like yours, and definitely, yeah,
Oh, and we're like middle of the road too. There's some much larger.
yeah. Well, as far as healthcare organizations go, they are, as you know, Eric, highly complex, far-reaching. There's a lot of unique issues. There's a lots of sensitive, very sensitive data. You've got teams of doctors, teams of nurses. You got office workers doing accounting, insurance. Maybe you have security personnel that have unique needs. I mean, there's just all these very unique and very challenging organizational issues that need to be addressed through technology, and that kind of applies to backup and DR as well. So again, kind of hitting this piece home, disparate departments have different RTO and RPO requirements based on the criticality of the workload, right? So, Eric, you probably speak to this a little bit better than I can because my healthcare experience is a couple years out of date now. But as a general RTO, it's going to be more aggressive in this situation than we did in our supply chain example, right?
Depends. Again, it really depends on what you're talking about.
Right.
Your surgeons need the lights and the air handlers turned on, and they can do their job. You know.
Right. We don't want a surgeon doing and trying to do their job in the dark. Absolutely.
No, no. But then, yeah, other things, and it's interesting. You get back to a lot of similarities with your supply chain people because we have patients that are now discharged and they really want to go home, and if their discharge paperwork won't print, we have a really upset patient and an
Right.
upset family, and there are some surprising similarities across these different departments, or sorry,
Right.
different verticals.
Right. The other big thing, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit already, is that you may have some very critical workloads for a healthcare organization, right? I mean, potentially some of your systems may be involved in somebody being alive or dead, right?
Yes, absolutely,
So, I mean,
absolutely.
you might have a situation. I put 10 minutes on here, and I mean, realistically, it could be even more aggressive than that, right?
We tend to try not to put any life safety stuff in this position.
Right.
So a lot of this is also knowing your vertical and understanding. And if you look through at a lot of your healthcare systems, they're basically designed around the idea that, like, I've got a lot of stuff that does report back to a home server, but if the network drops, it continues to function,
Right.
right? So,
Yep.
so where you get here, some interesting stuff is like, oh, everybody needs to move to the cloud instantly. It's like, well, I really need my accountability chain to be as short as I can possibly make it.
Right.
So we have, everything has a battery in it and it works autonomously for a while, maybe up to an hour or whatever. So you're correct, but we also realize the criticality of our systems. And so we do design a lot of near right at that point of failure where that could happen. We do build a lot of scaffolding in. So sometimes we can survive longer than other people, more than you might think.
Right.
But do you want to get down to, do you need these super short RTOs, RPOs? Sometimes we do, yes, yes.
Right. Well, like you mentioned earlier, I mean, it's important to know your organization, right? So you need to go have those conversations with the key stakeholders that support, on the front lines, they support those life-saving and really critical systems, right? So that you at least know you can plan on, okay, hey, if my data center, blew up one day, that those systems would continue to function. At least you've had that conversation internally as an organization. You know that those systems would continue to run in a disaster situation. And then the other thing about this particular example is, HIPAA regulation, right? We have patient data that has to be strictly protected. So, to me, instantly, I'm thinking, okay, encryption. Any copy of the data needs to be encrypted, definitely. I'm also thinking, data retention, 7-10 years, different requirements based on, I think, not HIPAA specifically, but based on your regulation, different requirements, right? But typically, I think the common ones I run into are 7 and 10 years, right? So I guess, Eric, from there, again, as author of the Backup Bible, where would you start with this? How would you start architecting? What conversations would you have? How would you go about putting this plan together?
This is the one where communications are super important. You've got to get out. You've got to get a lot of voices. Uh, Sometimes when we go in and we architect from the solution perspective. So one of the big things that I work with is our nurse call system. So if you're a patient, you can push a button and someone will come call you or help you out, whatever you need. And there's a lot of studies on this that, how long between a patient putting that button and them saying, you know what, forget it, I'll do it myself, and then putting themselves in danger because, if you're in a hospital, you're obviously there for a reason, and we don't want you getting out of bed. So this is kind of our thing is who knows that, who understands when those systems are down, how long they're going to be out, what the kind of the risks are again. So, and you may not necessarily write that down, like in the backup Bible, we talk about fire and arson and people stealing your stuff. Well, like in my case, if I have a patient who gets up and out of bed to go to the bathroom because nobody came to talk to them, and then they fall down and hurt themselves, that's a risk, and it's a big one.
Right.
If you are just working in the back room and you don't realize that that's one of your highest risks, then the only way to find that out is through communication, because you can't be MD, PhD, and also the guy who maintains the entire backup. There's only so much you can know. So make sure
Right.
that those communications are super important. I can't overstress that enough. You've got to start with the communications and finding out what's important and trying to frame things in the way that they can understand. And also, again, always use your price as, yes, I can do this, but this is what it's going to cost you. And that
Right.
really helps you find the things that matter.
And again, coming back to that information gathering and the communication, right? I'm sensing a common theme here because again, the technology piece of it, that's the easy part, right? So
Yes.
having all these upfront conversations, gathering the needed information, that's really the key consideration here. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop out to a demo really quick. And we've talked about a highly regulated environment, right? And some of the interesting and unique situations that presents. So like in a situation where we have a need for like an insanely low RTO, right? Our workload goes down, we need to be back up in 5-10 minutes. So I've actually been in this situation personally with a healthcare provider back in my MSP days, and they had a standalone SQL box, which despite our best efforts to get them to change, that basically held the patient records database. So everything in this organization depended on this one standalone SQL box. And this thing held, things like CT scans and imaging data as well. So the database was huge. We're talking like 8 terabytes in size or something like that. And of course, their backup application that they were using at the time didn't have anything like a boot from backup feature, which I'm going to show you here in a second. So it took 22 hours to recover that data. Meanwhile, they can't do anything for their patients, right? Which is a big deal. So when you have an application that can do something like boot from backup, that is that's a big deal in this situation where you have a low RTO. So I'm using our product as an example here. We have an option called boot from backup underneath our restore category. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to actually boot a virtual machine from the backup storage. So instead of having to go through that whole restore process, you can get the virtual machine up quickly, and away you go. Your users can use it. Now there's 2 modes here. There's verification mode and recovery mode. The difference being verification mode just brings the VM up, right? And you can poke around with it, use it, test it. Recovery mode is actually in that oh crap situation, right? It brings the VM up. Users can start using it. All the changes are captured in a differencing file, and in the background, a recovery job happens. So in the example I just gave, we come in here, we do recovery mode, and the restoration of the production VM would slowly happen over that 20, 22 hour, 24 hour period. Meanwhile, they're able to use this backup booted version of the VM, and all the changes are being captured. And at the end of that process, all those changes are rolled up into the production VM, so nothing is lost. So just to give you an idea how this process works, I'm just going to step through the verification version of it because it's a little bit shorter in the sake of time. So basically, I have to select, hey, what backup repository do I want to look at? What virtual machine do we want to bring up in a boot from backup fashion? Let's say we're having issues with this particular file server. I'm going to hit next. And what it's going to do is it's going to scan for all the different versions of the backups that I can choose. And we're going to choose one that's application consistent. Let's go with this one. And I'm going to say, okay, what's the name inside of my hypervisor? What's the boot host? What's the boot to location? By default, we will disable the virtual NIC on the virtual machine. That way you don't have two machines talking under the same host name and IP at the same time. And what we do is we just click boot. And what that'll do is it'll start this process of actually booting the virtual machine. Now, in this particular instance, I'm using Hyper-V. If I hop out here to Hyper-V Manager, in a second here, I'll actually see that boot from backup VM show up as a third VM here in the list. So it's usually fairly quick, and what it's doing is under the hood, it's facilitating an iSCSI connection between the backup storage and the hypervisor that I target. So here you can see that, hey, there's this instant boot version now of the virtual machine. It shows as booted, and at this point, I can connect to it and I can interact with it just like I would any other virtual machine. So here the VM is still booting, as you can see, and in a second, I'll be given the login prompt. So this is running Windows Server Core, so I obviously just have the, the text-based interface, but it kind of gives you the idea of what it looks like. So yeah, I could interact, I could use that virtual machine in a recovery situation, selecting recovery mode. My users would be able to go ahead and consume that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say discard VM. It gets rid of the VM. Again, if it was a recovery situation, we had selected recovery mode. At the end of that process, it would roll the captured changes back into the main image. The other thing I wanted to talk about really briefly is Eric had mentioned, accountability and making sure that you can test and verify, right? So inside of our application, we have the ability to do sandbox restores and scheduled testing and verification. But there's some organizations that need a little bit more than that, right? There's a lot of these backup applications that they'll send you a screenshot of the login screen after it's been test restored. It doesn't tell you anything about the processes running within that VM, right? So I've got some organizations that have that requirement where we can actually leverage the Altero REST API that we have with the product. So I have customers that use this REST API to actually facilitate that test restore, and then they will actually pair that with like PowerShell remoting to reach inside the VM and say, hey, SQL, are you there? And SQL will report back, yes, the service is running and this database is up. So, if you're interested in any of that type of information, we actually have some extensive API documentation. Go to altero.com/API, and it will show you all the different commands and use cases that you can use. I can send instructions, like I said earlier, after I get a session token, I can initiate a sandbox restore right from the REST API, and then pair that, like I said, with some PowerShell code to do exactly the verification and those things that are required, right? So from that, I'm going to go ahead and scoot back to the slide deck. We got a lot to cover yet in not much time, so we're going to move right along. So we've got case study number 3. This is the fun one, right, Eric?
Yes, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, so you guys get to choose what we're going to talk about and how we would build this last use case. So everybody's paying attention, right? Right? Okay, everybody, get your keyboards and your mouses, your mice ready. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw 3 polls at you in fairly quick succession here. So there's going to be 3 polls. You get to choose industry vertical, size of company, and budget, right? So this is what we're going to do. So first one I'm going to present is industry vertical. So I'm going to give it about 30 seconds. I'm going to launch that poll and pick your industry vertical. So for this third case study, what vertical are we working in? I get the feeling, Eric, that people are gonna they're gonna mess with us. If it was me, I know which one I would pick just to mess with the mess.
If you're deliberately trying to sabotage us, yes, I have my eye on a couple of them.
Yep, it's happening, as I knew it would.
Is it? They're out to get us.
It was for a second. It was for a second. I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now. And we actually ended up with professional services.
I am surprised.
I'm surprised too. I thought for sure it was going to be banking just to mess with us, right? Banking or government, right? So, all right, we got professional services. So I'm thinking like accounting offices or law firms, or What do you think, Eric? For this example, maybe let's just go with a law firm. How do you feel about that?
Perfect.
All right, law firm. That's what we're going with. All right, second poll. Organization size. I'm going to launch that. How large is this law firm? I know I know the size that most law firms fall under, but there are some fairly large ones too. Excuse me. So we're gonna give that a minute or two here. I don't know. I personally don't know any law firms over 200 employees. Do you, Eric?
Not that I've ever worked with, certainly.
I'm sure there are, but not that I've ever worked with personally. So let's see, 5 more seconds here. It looks like we're gonna end up in the SMB space. All right, I'm gonna close that and share the results. And yeah, we got 76% have selected SMB. So we've got an SMB law firm. We're gonna hide that. And then for our last case study, what is the budget? Now, the budget is relative to size of the organization. Now, obviously, a small budget for an enterprise is a lot different than a small budget for an SMB, right? I'm thinking we're right down the middle as between small and medium here.
Really?
It's so close. I know which one I want, but no, lost it. I wish you guys could see the bars changing like I can. All right, we're gonna go ahead and close that and share. And to no one's surprise, we end up with no budget.
No.
Now, excuse me. Now, the joke I had for this particular point in the webinar was I thought for sure people were going to choose banking with a small budget. And I was going to say, as a joke, get your lawyers ready. I can't use this joke in this particular example because we're dealing with a law firm. So thanks, guys. I spent so long figuring out that joke. You came here for the bad jokes, right? Anyway, I'm going to scoot past that. So let's go ahead and start kind of walking through this example. So, whoops, I got ahead of myself. So for this particular example, we've got a law firm. Helps if I capitalize correctly. So for a law firm, what are your initial thoughts right out of the gate, Eric?
Your big thing here is obviously going to be you have to keep meticulous records, and you are not going to be very tolerant to data loss.
Right. Can be little to no data loss. And that's because we got things like legal records, right? So I mean, potentially the data that you have is the difference between somebody going to jail or not, right? Or a suit going through or not, right? That data and that evidence is so critical. So little to no data loss. So right out of the gate, I'm thinking like, what, 5-minute RPO, 10-minute RPO? It's going to be fairly, maybe not that aggressive.
That's a little too much, I think. It's and most of your law offices are still working with paper to some level. So if not, then they're working with transmitted data. So somebody somewhere usually has a copy.
So maybe we go with like a two-hour RPO, you think?
Let's say 2 hours. I think we'd be safe with 2 hours.
2-hour RPO requirement. Okay. As far as RTO goes, like you said, a law firm, we're going to be dealing with a lot of paper, right? So I mean, if systems are down, they at least have their legal briefs, their legal documents that they can go to if they want. So I think what I've seen in my experience doing IT for law firms over the years seems to be one business day is about the RTO, because typically you've got lawyers coming and going back and forth to court. You've got meetings happening where they're just keeping pen and paper notes anyway, right? For the most part. So we go with an 8-hour RTO. And then for a legal firm, if I had to guess, most of them are probably going to leverage, something like Office 365, right, for mail, at least, possibly SharePoint. I'm just trying to think of the different types of data they would have in play. Typically, there's going to be some sort of, business-centric application. Like the one I remember off the top of my head is a program called Abacus, which seemed to be an application that a lot of law firms use for some of their day-to-day operations. So here I'm thinking like, okay, these are some of the key requirements. What kind of conversations would you be having for this particular use case, Eric? What would be, how would you approach this, now that we have some of the basic requirements figured out?
Sure. Because I have experience in this particular field, the first thing I want to walk in and go, are you really doing this Office 365? Because I have worked with a lot of lawyers who are just really untrusting,
Yeah.
and they're going to want to bring that as much as they can in-house and have it sitting like under their desk. They don't even want a server cabinet. They want it under their desk
Uh,
because they
Exchange
just
server running under the
don't
desk.
trust. Yes, because they just really don't have that trust level for anybody. So I focus a lot of times, and also going back to the paper thing, which is kind of universal across all firms, is we kind of turn away the focus on data because data is relatively easy to protect, and we get into a premises problem like a fire, right? Something that actually puts more at risk than just the simple data because, if they're working in the short term with paper and you have paralegals there who aren't, I guess sometimes they're not as intimately involved in the cases. They know, that they're shuffling paper. It just depends on how deep and how large it is. Now, small when your paralegals tend to run the show, so maybe it's not such a big deal. But you do have to kind of consider where are the knowledge points? Where does the knowledge really live?
Right.
And if you're in there just talking to the lawyers and you don't give the paralegals a chance to talk, then you may miss out on something because a lot of times the lawyers have one idea of what's going on, and you even brought this up in the very beginning, is the principals might come back and go, I know this, I know that, I know the other, and then you turn around and then the woman who's answering the front desk phone is like, well, there's a whole lot that goes on that he doesn't know about because he doesn't have time or whatever else. He's delegated so much he's forgotten that we do this.
Right.
So the bigger part there is just like in actual law, discovery is such a big deal. So when you go into a law firm to do work for them, your discovery is a big deal.
Right, definitely. We've got Andrew in the chat actually brought up a really good point here. He mentions OneDrive, which now sends me down the path of, okay, we're using cloud storage on the endpoints, which then brings me to endpoint backup. So, I mean, in this situation, you've got lawyers that, maybe they're in the office 40% of the time. They've got their
Right.
laptops, they're out at courthouses, they're meeting with clients. How would you approach like an endpoint backup in this situation?
In this kind of situation, what I get down into is you really need multiple copies of everything. So endpoint is notoriously unreliable in a disconnected environment. I mean, if you put your laptop in your briefcase and then you go home and leave it in the trunk and the sun bakes it and turns it into the plastic soup, what good is having a backup program installed on the laptop? So, or somebody just breaks in and steals it. There's a million things that can happen. So
Right.
your transitory nature is the problem. So if you're going to use something like OneDrive, which I think is great, then your big deal there is less about your backup and recovery and more about is that being synchronized. And then on the back end on your Office 365 data is something taking care of that too. So like if you get a ransomware hit or you save something and don't
Yep.
notice it for a while so that you can't go into the history and get it, things like that. That's where I really get worried.
Right, definitely. So you'd more leverage the cloud storage for the distributed endpoints. And then yeah, definitely that brings up the whole conversation of like, okay, well, I'm using Office 365, but do I leverage, the built-in tools that are inside the platform, or do I leverage a third party? So one thing that's a whole another ball of wax having that conversation. We could do a whole webinar on that particular subject. But I will say that again, with our small budget in mind, I would go out on a limb and guess, again, you'd want to verify this, but I would assume that this law office is probably using some of the lower tier Office 365 licenses, which unless you have E3 or higher in the Office 365 space, you don't have some of those fancier built-in data retention tools. And that's where
Right.
like a third-party backup player would come into play then, right? Because a third-party backup can generally protect your Office 365 data regardless of the type of license that you have in the Office 365 space. So yeah, I think what we're looking at here for this particular use case is multiple tools, right? And I think that's
Yes.
probably going to be the case for every situation.
Yes.
You're going to be leveraging multiple tools to have that comprehensive backup and DR strategy.
And don't forget your small things too, because if I email you a copy of your legal brief, that's a copy.
Right? That's true.
So don't forget the simple things that you've always had. Don't get so wrapped up in what you can do with this really super in-depth technology that you forget the basics. Now then you get back into, did you encrypt it? Does
Yep.
that kind of thing need encryption? Like most of your briefs are public records, so they don't really matter. But some of the stuff is confidential between, it's protected, privileged information. So are you encrypting
Right.
your email? And all of these things play in. The whole thing is because if somebody steals a privileged email, that's a data compromise. That's
There is.
an ethical problem. That's a legal problem. So on and so forth. And if they yank it off of your backup drive, that's just as bad.
Right. Definitely. All right. Well, that was a good discussion, good example, everyone. Appreciate you participating. We got a couple of Q&A things, a couple of wrap-up things before our Q&A. Go ahead and get your questions put in the Q&A form. I've got, I think, 2 slides to talk through here, and we'll start tackling Q&A. We got a couple of good questions that have come in. So while I go through these, Eric, that should give you a second to kind of take a look through the Q&A and flag any of them that you want to address. So first thing I want to do is and I'll talk to you about some of the resources that are available here. Obviously, we've talked about the backup Bible quite a bit throughout this webinar. So there's the landing page for that. If you want to go and grab that, again, you can just grab it at the side of the screen. Either this, I'm not sure what side it's on, but somewhere in the GoToWebinar UI, you can also grab a copy there. We do have a new section of the Altero blog coming, the Backup and DR Dojo. So as everybody knows, our blog is dojo themed. We have a backup and DR section coming. So when that becomes available, you will be notified via the email that you provided to sign up for this webinar. So be on the lookout for that. They'll have a lot of great content, some of it written by Eric as well. If you want some of Eric's other articles, he's been a long-time contributor to the Altero Hyper-V blog, so I linked to his section of the blog there, as well as just some general Hyper-V, VMware, and MSP-related resources. Additionally, like I mentioned earlier, you might want to leverage an Office 365 backup application. Just so happens that we happen to have one, Altero Office 365 backup. So really it allows you to do annual or multi-year subscriptions, and allows you to back up your mailboxes. It allows you to back up OneDrive, SharePoint sites, and so on and so forth. So really it's hassle-free. It's centralized management. We handle the storage for you, so you don't have to worry about standing up your own storage. And it's all under one inclusive fee with indefinite retention, so which is always nice. If you want a little bit more information just in general on Altero Backup Solutions, you go to altero.com for more information, and you can sign up for a 30-day trial of most, if not all, of our applications. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. You can also contact us at support@altero.com or sales@altero.com for more information. We also have live chat available at support.altero.com as well. And those guys have been known to answer any and all questions that you may have. Our support team is fantastic. I have nothing but fantastic things to say about them. So from there, Q&A. So we'll probably go over time a little bit here just to make sure we can answer as many questions as possible. But Eric, have you seen any that really stand out that you want to address?
You do have a lot of really great questions about the product, and I'm just going to punt all of those to you. There is one in here that we did not touch on retention policy, and this person's name is not in the culture I'm familiar with, so I'm not going to butcher it. But asked about for our 2-hour RTO and RPO, what kind of retention policy would we want to use? And I think that's great question in a lot of ways, because retention policy is not necessarily tied to your RTO or RPO. Sometimes you have a super short retention policy, but you can't lose very much historical, and sometimes it goes the other way, and sometimes you have the worst case scenario. We have a really short recovery requirement, but also a super long retention policy. And what I want to say is, like, the Altero product and a whole lot of other things that in a lot of ways made this easier for us because of the deduplication aspect, where you can take 2 or 3 complete backups, and there's only so far you want to go. You don't want to put too many eggs into a single deduplication basket, but you can get much more retention out of modern technology than you could like even 10 years ago.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And you can also, for like your long-term storage, if you want to take a drive offline forever, then their drives are now like $100 for how much capacity can you get for $100 these days, and take it offline forever. And a cold drive is usually it's slow to restore from, but they're usually pretty reliable.
Yep.
I would like to answer the question exactly as presented, as what would the retention policy be, and I don't think I can do that, but yeah, you could I wish we had more time to crack into that, because that's a great, fantastic
Really,
question.
it comes back to the individual requirements of the organization too, right? Like you said, I mean, you know, I think the leadership team of that organization would know one way or the other. They at least be able to kind of give you an idea, right?
All right. And
Then
again,
you
walk
could,
in there. If you give me enough money, I'll make
right?
it last forever.
Exactly. And
Right.
I think I think that's where IT and leadership come together. You know, obviously leadership is always thinking about the fiscal aspect of things, right? Where IT says, hey, this is the technology we have available, or hey, this is the technology that we can get for the dollar amount you're willing to spend. And typically what I found is you meet in the middle somewhere, right? You don't usually get to the RTO, RPO that leadership wants, but you kind of meet somewhere in the middle. Because like you said earlier, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a meeting with an MSP client, an end client of an MSP, and they said, okay, we can never be down. We need 2-minute RPO, and okay, well, let me add 3 zeros to the estimate, right? And then they fall out of their chair, and then the conversation becomes a little bit more realistic, right? And kind of meet in the middle there.
Yep.
One question that I wanted to make sure that, speaking of leadership, one question I wanted to make sure we covered that I ended up seeing was, what do you do in a situation where you can't get buy-in from leadership to go through this process? I've actually seen this several times where IT knows it's a priority. They want to go through this exercise, but leadership just either doesn't see value in it or they don't see time. And I know how I've handled it in the past. Typically, it involves a blanket RTO, RPO, and a bunch of emails to cover your rear end and say, okay, Mr. CEO or Mr. CFO or whoever, unless I get other direction from you, this is what our RTO and RPOs are going to be. And what I found works really well also in those situations is 2 things. First, if your organization has to adhere to some sort of regulatory compliance, that makes it really easy, because now if I'm if I'm a bank, I can go and go to my leadership and say, hey, we're not compliant with, I think it's SOX for financial institutions, right? We're not compliant here. This could be our penalty here, here, and here. This is the financial cost for not being compliant. That makes it really easy usually, right? And then the other side of it is trying to put it in real world terms as far as the fear aspect of the conversation, right? So I find that I hate to use fear to try and motivate people, because just morally it always feels icky to me.
And it
But
doesn't
I
last. It
found
wears
that,
off.
what's that?
It doesn't last. It wears off. You can only hold
Right.
a gun to somebody's head for so long before, like, you know what, just forget it. I'm not afraid of you anymore.
Exactly, right? But what I found is that you can at least initially use it to try and frame the conversation that says, hey, what are the 2 most important applications in the building? Okay, so we'll use a manufacturer as an example. It's the SolidWorks, the engineering files that the engineers use to design and build the product, and the software that runs the shipping department. And then usually how I framed it in the past is I'll say, hey, what would happen? How much money would be lost if both of those things just disappeared right now? And usually that's enough to say, you kind of see the thought process in their brain, where they're like, oh yeah. And now all of a sudden it becomes a priority, because now you've given them a tangible example, right? I found that works really well as well. I don't know, Eric, if you've got any other feedback for that particular question.
How much time do we have again?
We'll probably go for another minute or 2, and then we'll call it good.
One thing I have found that does kind of help is to talk to them in their terms. So sit down, get yourself a template for a service level agreement, and write down and say that due to the technological constraints placed upon blah, 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 and go into it, and then say, I promise you that I can keep your data for about, 3 hours, but you could be down for 3 days, and just really make your SLA kind of scary, and say, this is all I can promise you, because this is all I've been given to work with.
Right.
and then just leave it on their desk. And so if they come back and go, why? And you just always pull up that SLA and go, this is the one this is what I committed to, because this is all that you committed to. And
Yep. Yep.
it's a rough situation. There's no great answer. And we've all had that boss. So.
Yep. Yep. All right, I think we've got time for one more question. And again, if we didn't answer your question, we'll be sure to do a follow-up blog post with the full list of the questions on all their associated answers. But there's one here I want to touch on briefly, and we've got one person asking about, you know, how do you, and it's a very common question we see in the industry right now, is how do you protect against crypto locker type stuff, right? How do you protect your backups and your DR strategy from being affected by you know, crypto locker malware, right? And I always fall back to the air gapping discussion, and I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that, Eric. How would you approach that particular situation?
Well, I never do air gapping at the infrastructure level. I just don't believe in it, and we could go into that for hours again. But for the backup, you have to have a disconnected backup, and this has been true forever. This is not new. You cannot just connect your online repository and shovel data into it forever and expect that to work long term. It's great to have that, but you also need to have something disconnected, something offline, something unpowered, something in a safe somewhere. You know what I mean? This is always your first best line of defense. It's something that just is simply not connected. And then we're going to get more mature as time goes onward. You can do things like keep tight control on the account that can actually write to that location, so that it is not running actively and it is difficult for a program coming in to steal and overtake that account. You can actually lock administrators out of write access and just put in just this backup program. And it's not that it can't be overcome, it's just that you're giving them that extra barrier that's uncommon, and you know, they have to think about that in advance. That kind of answers.
All comes back to the planning and discussions and knowing what the risks and pitfalls are. Definitely. I'm hearing a common theme today: communication, right?
Yes.
Well, with that, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I know we've gone a little bit over, so I want to say thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's always great having you on for these, and we appreciate your questions. And again, if you asked a question that did not get answered, we will be sure to address those in a blog post. Eric, I want to thank you for coming today and sharing your knowledge. And if you haven't downloaded and read the Backup Bible, highly recommend it. A lot of great information, and it expands so much on the stuff that we've talked about in today's webinar. So with that, I'll leave you with a couple of Altero related links, some of which you've seen already, and let you get back to your day. And thanks for watching. We hope to see you again for a future Altero webinar. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone.